Good evening. Good evening. I believe we're online now, so I will begin. I'm going to begin with a few short quotes just to give people time to join the session, and then I'm going to move into psychology and alchemy. This is a free-form Jung reading group session, so I will respond to comments and questions, and so I'll just begin. Okay, so to begin with, I'm going to be reading from C.G. Jung, Psychological Reflections, a new anthology of his writings, 1905 to 1961. And I'm going to read from the section of this book entitled The Way to God. So I'm on page 336. And this is a series of quotes. They're generally not more than a half a page long. So the first one reads as follows. For thousands of years, the mind of man has worried about the sick soul, perhaps even earlier than it did about the sick body. The propitiation of gods, the perils of the soul and its salvation, these are not yesterday's problems. Religions are psychotherapeutic systems in the truest sense of the word, and on the grandest scale. They express the whole range of the psychic problem in mighty images. They are the avowal and recognition of the soul, and at the same time the revelation of the soul's nature. From this universal foundation, no human soul is cut off. Only the individual consciousness that has lost its connection with the psychic totality remains caught in the illusion that the soul is a small circumscribed area, a fit subject for scientific theorizing. The loss of this great relationship is the prime evil of neurosis. And that is from an essay called The State of Psychotherapy Today, from volume 10 of the collected works of C.G. Jung, Civilization in Transition. Good evening, Mallory. Welcome. Hello, Andy. And thank you for telling me how I screwed up last time. I need to do this again because, okay, now I've changed it to live chat. Hello, Grenade. Grenade says, I had a dream the other night where I was hiking on top of a snowy mountain with a group of people I had never met. One of the girls said, the Lord gives. Then I responded with, and the Lord takes. And then did someone fall off the mountain? Anyway, I make it a general practice not to respond. And she walked off the mountain and committed suicide. Her boyfriend jumped off shortly after. Creepy dream. Thought I'd share it. Okay. Oh, wow, that's Edinger. It's not quite as bad as Nebuchadnezzar's dream, but anyway, I make it a practice, as you probably know, not to comment on other people's dreams because I'm not a mental health professional, but you're certainly welcome to take it up with some of the other participants here. Okay, so the next quote is, the very absurdity and impossibility of religious statements are the real ground for belief, as was formulated most brilliantly in Tertullian's Prosus credible quia ineptum. And in parentheses it says, The audacity of Tertullian's argument is undeniable, and so is its danger, but that does not detract from its psychological truth. And there's an asterisk where it translates a long Latin sentence into, and the Son of God is dead, which is to be believed because it is absurd, and buried, he rose again, which is certain because it is impossible. So an improbable opinion has to submit sooner or later to correction, but the statements of religion are the most improbable of all, and yet they persist for thousands of years. Their wholly unexpected vitality proves the existence of a sufficient cause which has so far eluded scientific investigation. And that's from Transformation, Symbolism of the Mass, paragraph 379. Then the ways and customs of childhood, once so sublimely good, can hardly be laid aside even when their harmfulness has long since been proved. The same, only on a gigantic scale, is true of the historical changes of attitude. A collective attitude is equivalent to a religion, and changes of religion constitute one of the most painful chapters in the world's history. In this respect, our age is afflicted with a blindness that has no parallel. We think we have only to declare an accepted article of faith incorrect and invalid, and we shall be psychologically rid of all the traditional effects of Christianity or Judaism. We believe in enlightenment as if an intellectual change of front somehow had a profounder influence on the emotional processes or even on the unconscious. We entirely forget that the religion of the last 2,000 years is a psychological attitude, a definite form and manner of adaptation to the world without and within, which lays down a definite cultural pattern and creates an atmosphere which remains wholly uninfluenced by any intellectual denials. And that's from Psychological Types, paragraph 313. Okay, so that's a start. How is everybody tonight? Nice to see all of you back. Tonight I'm going to work through a few more paragraphs of Psychology and Alchemy, and this is volume 12 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. And before I begin that, though, I just want to point out that in the last few days I've been reading this book, Catafalque, by Peter Kingsley, and Carl Jung and the End of Humanity. Peter doesn't hold back, but it's a fascinating read, and it's actually 2 volumes, volume 1 and volume 2, and the second volume is, I really like to put that up like that so you can see it, how nice it is as a set. The second volume is all the footnotes, and Peter has put in footnotes that are pages long. I just opened to this page, and that's one footnote. And it doesn't stop there. It goes, it's a 3.5-page footnote. But anyway, it's a fascinating read. It's light, it's relatively light reading, but it's important because it describes how the Jungian community, that is the Jungian analyst community, has completely missed the boat on Jungian psychology. And I've long thought this because the Jungian analysts are mainly focused on individual psychotherapy, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's a valid profession, but it doesn't allow us to apply Jungian psychology to all the other issues in life, and some of these are very important political issues. And so I've long been influenced by Dr. Jung in terms of the political implications of what he has said. And I even published a book in 2014 called Political Psychology, New Ideas for Activists. And if you're a member of our Dropbox, you can get an electronic copy of that book for free. And just go ahead and tear it apart as much as you like. I'd love to have your critique on Amazon. But anyway, on Peter's book, Peter has spent 5 years writing this book, and it is just an incredible piece of scholarship. And he is concerned that people won't appreciate and understand it, or at least the Jungian community won't, because he's critical of the Jungian community. And so if you are in university, or if you are near a library, the set of books costs $75, so I'm not asking anybody to go out and spend that much money. I know many of you are unable to spend that kind of money for a book. But if you would go to your local library or your university library and ask for the book on interlibrary loan, that would be very helpful to Peter, because it would get the libraries and universities starting to put the book on their shelves, and that would be helpful. And so Peter has also written several more books showing how in antiquity psychology was being practiced mostly by priests. They didn't know it was psychology at the time. And so he made a number of really brilliant discoveries in his career. And I spoke to him a week ago, and he said that, you know, he didn't have any income for the last 5 years while he wrote this book. So I would have very much appreciated if you would go to interlibrary loan and ask them to get the book for you, and that would get the juices of the library system in universities going. Yeah, let's see. Grace says, I can't wait to read Catafalque. It is a terrific read. I've been just entirely engrossed by it. It's really a compelling book. And Peter has a wonderful way of drawing you along. It's fairly light reading. He used large print, so it's fairly easy to read, as you can see. It's not small print, and it just goes from one chapter to the next, and you really can't wait to see what's going to happen next in terms of your own psyche. And it's basically all about Jung's relationship to the evolution of the human psyche, and Peter's kind of different take on it. And Peter is able to have the different take because he reads Greek and Latin, among other things, and German. And so he can tell where some people have mistranslated, for example, and that's very useful. And so going on here, Mallory says, glad to be here, been trudging through memory streams, reflections. Usually I tear through a book this size in a day, but Jung is dense. Yes, he's very dense. And I've actually probably read that book 10 times, but I always read it on audible.com. There's a terrific audible version of it, and it's really worth having, because then you feel like you're sitting with Jung, even though you're not. But there's someone with a British style accent that makes it seem like it's foreign to Americans, and therefore makes it feel like you're listening to Jung, and I very much appreciate that. And so, as I say, I've listened to the whole book probably 10 times at this point. Grenade says, Freud gives psychoanalysis a system to go by, but Jung, the system is the individual, so it's hard to employ en masse. Yes, that is true. Freud, like most of the reductionist rationalists, wants to break everything down into a system. And Jung wanted people to discover what's in the fullness of the psyche. And so it's sort of the distinction between maybe me and Jordan Peterson. I don't disagree with Jordan Peterson on almost 100% of the psychological points that he makes. I only resist his idea that you can have rules and you can live your life by rules. And the point is that when you go to university or any school, you're learning the ropes, you're learning the rules of how to do whatever it is, whether it's microeconomics or blocks, whatever it is a kid might do. And so you're learning those rules, but that isn't life. And so when you go out into life, you have to make different decisions. And so one of the things that we will talk about tonight, and let me see if I can get to it easily, I guess maybe I can, is the issue of probabilismus, okay, and probabilism. And so this is where the church came down with the idea that there's no clear black and white. And so I'll read this definition once for you, not now. I'll probably read it again later. But the point is that the church is making is that things aren't black and white. And so here's what they say. Probabilism is the name generally given to that way of thinking which is content to answer scientific questions with a greater or lesser degree of probability. The moral probabilism, which alone we are concerned here, consists in the principle that the acts of ethical self-determination are to be guided not by conscience, but according to what is probably right, i.e., according to whatever has been recommended by any representative or doctrinal authority. The Jesuit probabilist Escobar, who died in 1669, was, for instance, of the opinion that if the penitent should plead a probable opinion as the motive of his action, the father confessor would be obliged to absolve him, even if he were not of the same opinion. Escobar quotes a number of Jesuit authorities on the question of how often one is bound to love God in a lifetime. According to one opinion, loving God once shortly before death is sufficient. Another says once a year or once every 3 or 4 years. He himself comes to the conclusion that it is sufficient to love God once at the first awakening of reason, then once every 5 years, and finally once in the hour of death. In his opinion, the large number of different moral doctrines forms one of the main proofs of God's kindly providence, because they make the yoke of Christ so light. Okay, so, you know, it's probably okay if you murder someone in an act of war. Yeah, okay. You know, it's probably okay if you commit adultery. Yeah, maybe. Under what circumstances would that be? I mean, that's the type of thing that we get into here. So, hello, Patricia, welcome. You guys got ahead of me here. So, so anyway, the point was that we have to live our lives. The rules are there for us to be educated, so we can be educated. But they have to get us to the point where we can make our own decisions. But then we have to live our lives and make our own decisions. And if you try to live your life by very strict rules, you'll find yourself constricted very soon. And so, let's see. Mallory says, I think Jung makes some types feel threatened. That is certainly true, because people who are extremely rationalistic don't want to be left in having to make decisions. I often talk about how Marines would often come to me and they would say, tell me what to do, I'll do it exactly and precisely, but I don't want to deal with the politics. And the problem is that it's all politics. Life is politics. When you're negotiating with your spouse about what time dinner is, that's politics. And there's no rule to decide that. And, you know, or what time you're going to have your next intimate encounter. That's all politics. And so you have to learn to live your life and to live it probably with a partner. And so there are no specific rules that are going to work that out for you. And so, yes, that is threatening. I agree, Mallory, that a lot of people must feel that's very difficult. And Gray says, yes, anyone who thinks they're right will be threatened or repulsed by Jung. Yep. And Patricia says, thank you. Psychonaut, I have been into the idea of psychological alchemy for a while and found out about Jung a week ago. Can't wait to read his stuff. There's a lot. Yep, there's, as of today, there are 863 videos on this YouTube channel where we're talking about these things. And so you might find it useful to listen to a few of those. If you go to JRG1, there's playlists, and I put a pointer to a playlist called JRG1, and just mention that here because that has the first year of our discussion of Dr. Jung's work, and it begins with Man and His Symbols. And so if you're just joining us now, I urge you to go back and listen to some of those earlier videos. JRG means Jung Reading Group, 1 means year 1. So we're just wrapping up year 3 right now. So there's a JRG1, a JRG2, and a JRG3, which you can find in the playlist to follow up on that. Let's see. And Mallory says, well, wait a minute. Dioxide says, it's a dark rabbit hole. And that is true. Once you start on studying Carl Jung, you can never escape. I started, 32 years ago. And I'm still a neophyte. But get in due course, after you've read Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and Man and His Symbols, then you can come to this book, Catafalque, and understand Jung in a relatively light kind of way without getting into the real nuts and bolts. As far as alchemy is concerned, Kingsley comes to the conclusion that the one thing that the main thing that Jung was he became the crater, or the vase, the alchemical vase. And in the end, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about putting psychological ingredients into whatever it is, into your own psyche and your own life, into your relationship with your spouse, into your Cub Scout troop or your church or what have you, or your state or your politics. All those things are different cauldrons, and you put things in and they produce results. I once had a mentor that said, every time he put some new person into a group or took somebody out, he changed the group. And that's exactly right. And so being aware of that makes a lot of sense, because every time you put something new in your mind, it's going to change you in some way. And you are your own cauldron. So in terms of the Holy Grail now, and this is a whole area of Jungian psychology, in terms of the Holy Grail, the Grail is you, okay? And your experience with the things that Dr. Jung teaches us about, and Emma Jung, his wife, teaches us about. And he says, archetypal psychology makes one really examine their own motivations for their behavior. It's not pretty, but it definitely will help you. Yeah, it's not pretty. If you had a chance to look at my interview with Vincent Kennedy, the Irish artist, earlier this week, which is on the front page of the channel, you'll hear him say, it's not all rainbows. And it definitely is not. Mallory says, Jordan is entirely too J on the MBTI. Responsibility is his highest ideal, but us P's don't agree. Precisely, Mallory. And of course, I am a P also. And so I chafe at rules and the J types of things. And, I'm sure, from Jordan Peterson's perspective, we have to understand it. He's a clinical psychologist, and so he has seen industrial grade human suffering in his office for probably 25 or 30 years, and constantly, hour in and hour out. And so he obviously develops a certain outlook on how people should behave to prevent the types of human suffering that he runs into. And I don't blame him for that. I mean, that's understandable. I actually got out of the practice of law because I didn't like having to deal with other people's hardships all the time. And I wish I had realized that before I spent 8 years doing it, 3 in law school and 5 years actually practicing. And so, Peterson can be forgiven for that. But meanwhile, he's a brilliant man. He's way smarter than I am. And so I've actually learned a lot from him. And I definitely recommend watching his videos and reading his books. Tor says, Mallory, good take on it. Okay. the Grenade. Maybe you're balanced J, almost tipping over to P. Well, Grenade might be. We just don't know. I mean, with the MBTI, there's 16 gross personality types in that test, but actually we're all on a scale somewhere on the 4 scales. And so there's an infinite number of possibilities, and the MBTI only gives you the grossest, meaning the most generalized ideas of what these things are about. But there are many sort of fine points within each one of those scales. Psychonaut, Andy. Is it possible to see archetypes in dreams and understand the unconscious motive behind displaying them? It certainly is. And I guess Andy will answer that, but it certainly is possible to see archetypes in dreams, and and by considering your own dreams, you can appreciate the motive behind displaying them. But you can't go buy a dream book. Forget that. That just doesn't work. You have to examine each symbol yourself and say, what is this symbol trying to tell me right now, tonight, about my life or about the world in general, whatever it is. And Grenade says, it's likely I switched over to J at some point in my life when I had to get my shit together, so to speak. And that definitely happens. I've said a few times that when I put on my Marine Corps uniform, I become STJ, no doubt about it. And it's a very precise personality type, but I'm trained to it. And so when I put the uniform on, I am that archetypal Marine officer. But that doesn't mean that's my preferred way of being in the world, but that's the way I am when I put the uniform on, and that's how I stayed alive in Vietnam. And so when you have to have your shit together, you might want to be pretty J. And he says, dreams in Jungian psychology can often, whoops, got away with it. Well, you guys are getting way ahead of me tonight. Can often be indicative of hidden motivations and worries. Well, you know, your psyche is telling you things all the time. Your individual psyche is telling you things constantly. And it's not only during sleep. I'm convinced that what we know as dreams are also coming through during the daytime hours, except we're too distracted to notice them because they're too subtle during the day. But, you know, when they get unsubtle, they become a vision, a daytime vision that you can have. And, you know, if your psyche really wants you to know something, it'll give you a vision. And so that's kind of a daytime dream. And the stronger it is, the more your psyche wants you to pay attention. So I often talk about my vision of the police car. When I see a certain vision of a police car going across in front of me, from right to left, with the word police on the side of the car, it's a black and white, and it's always the same image, the same symbol. Whenever I see that, I know that I'm going to see police activity very soon, within a minute or two, and it invariably happens. And so my psyche keys in on things in the environment that tell it that there's police activity going on, and then it needs to tell me, and it needs to tell me while I'm awake because I'm driving, and so it gives me this vision. And so I'm convinced that these things are actually coming through. Our psyche is trying to give us messages that it thinks we need to know in compensation for what is actually happening. So let's say you make a decision that you're going to ask a girl out, and your psyche will compensate by saying, "Are you sure that's the one you want to ask out? Really?" And so that's a compensation. That's the opposite side of the story. But then you have to, your conscious mind, your 21st century mind says, "Yeah, that's the girl for me," and you have to go for it and ignore that part. That inferior side of your psyche. But that's what dreams often are doing, is doing this compensation, where they're saying, well, Dr. Jung says God wants to be, God wants to be alive in man, but not quite. So that's sort of the idea. Okay, Xavier says, I'm guessing it would be too spontaneous to do while in the dream. I'm not sure about that, because I'm not sure the context, Xavier. Happy I found out about Jung then. Sounds like a lot of self-work to understand yourself and motives, but well worth the work. There's no doubt about that. Thomas says, wondering lately what kind of dreams Jesus would have had. Well, I don't know. If you've ever seen Jesus Christ Superstar, you sort of get the idea of what that might have been, because in the show, at least, he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's having this conversation with God about, really, I really have to do this? And and he has doubts, and so that's the psyche saying, but not quite. and then he has to say, yes, I recognize that I have to be crucified in order to see this thing through to the end, which is what he did have to do. Andy says, it is 100%. I was well on my way to being a rock star when I had an enlightening experience that led me to this. I've never looked back. Well, there's hundreds of thousands of young people in the country that were on their way to being a rock star, but they went on The Voice, and that was a very good thing for them, because the truth is, we can't all be rock stars. It's not that easy. If you saw the Academy Awards last night with Bradley Cooper and Lady Gaga, and the performance the two of them did on the stage, that is not easy to pull that off. And so what The Voice does is it gives people a defeat so that they can go on to the next thing. They can be born into the next thing that they should be thinking about doing in their lifetime. At least in my opinion. Taurus says, Mallory, have you mentioned your type here before? If not, can we guess? Mallory says, you're welcome to guess. INFP is my guess. Good guess, says Mallory. Yeah, I think we have probably a lot of N's and maybe a lot of P's in this group also, and introverts. Xavier says. Mallory says, Skip, have you read Robert Johnson's book, Inner Work, about dream analysis, active imagination? I admit that I have not read it, and there are many books like that out there by various Jungian analysts, and that's one that I just have never gotten to, unfortunately. Mallory's comment. Peterson has big balls, no doubt. Well, he's developing a thick skin, that's for sure. Xavier says, I had an epiphany the other day that the self is always trying to communicate with me through how I interpret everything, especially when I get bitter. Yeah, you know, it is always trying to communicate with you in any case, at least so I believe. Thomas says, never saw Jesus Christ Superstar. I have a prejudice against musicals that I've never been able to shake. Okay, you know, you may be missing something, and especially with respect to that one. And I particularly like Evita as one, because it's raunchy in many ways, but it sort of expresses the time through music, and sometimes you can express an emotion through music that you can't do just by talking it through totally rationally. And Granat says, yeah, my enlightening or religious experience began with a massive sense of humility, and for the first time in my life accepted my lack of understanding, that it just all flooded in. I was literally on my knees. Well, that's the way it happens sometimes. You know, it's I did a reading earlier this afternoon on Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and you can really understand what Tony Wolfe, who was well, everybody believes that Tony Wolfe was Dr. Jung's paramour, but she was also just a part of the family and a part of the menage a trois that included Tony and Emma Jung. And she did a lecture on dreams. I have it here. And I think I put it in the Dropbox. It was done in 1934. Unfortunately, I couldn't read this very easily, so I had to pick it apart. I had to get a text file out of it, which then had to be cleaned up dramatically. But I did that, and then I read it today about Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And what she's talking about there is the fact that everyone's ego gets supercharged. Nebuchadnezzar's in a very special way, which was that he dreamed of this tree that you could see everywhere in the world from. And so he really thought he was the best thing that ever happened to the world, you know, only I can fix it type thing. And in the dream, a quote-unquote watcher from heaven came down and told him that he had to cut down the tree. And so if you're a man, you might know what cutting down the tree means, and at least symbolically. And so there was a lot going on in that dream, but Tony Wolfe explained it for us, and I did a reading earlier today, so you can find it right on the front page about that. Thomas says, have you delved into the transcendent function in previous videos that I might have missed? For those of us involved in certain types of creative work, it seems an important concept. I agree that it's an important concept. I've touched on it, but I haven't done a special program on it. And I'm due, I agree. And so I will make a note that that the transcendent function is important. And so what Thomas is talking about is how one breaks through between the conscious and the unconscious mind. And for creative types, it's like, you know, a famous novelist will write 2 or 3 novels that are bestsellers, and then they are unable to get back in the groove, and so they're said to have writer's block. And I'm convinced that that means that they've lost this connection through to the unconscious. Now, in my case, I find that I have no problem getting back in the zone if I want to, but I think that I have enough experience with it. But when in '93, when I didn't know what was going on with my psyche, and I wrote this novel, it was entirely written from the unconscious. And I was saying, wow, this must just be what famous novelists get connected up with, and isn't this cool? And boy, it would be terrible if I didn't have this connection with my unconscious, and that would be writer's block. And so you know, I do talk about it with others a fair amount, but it's about first of all, recognizing that there is something from your unconscious that wants to be said, and then letting it come forth. And what I've found basically is that if I just start on any creative project, including this meeting tonight, once I can start it, even if I have to do it very pedantically, very soon I can get in the groove and have the flow coming from my unconscious. So very often in these meetings, and if you go back through all the old videos, especially when we were meeting every week at Sammy's, I would have no clue about what I talked about in the evening. And then I'd go back the next day and I'd listen to it and I'd say, wow, this is pretty good. This is interesting stuff. And so then I would cut those videos up. I haven't been doing that lately because I've been more interested in getting more material out to people because there's a lot. And I figure if I get the videos laid down, then others can come back and edit them later if they want to or something. But and by the way, in terms of anything that I'm saying on any of my videos, feel free to steal them. You can adopt them in your videos if you want to, if you're into doing YouTube videos. And I have no objection whatsoever, and I make no secrets about what I say. I would prefer that you don't change what I say, but otherwise, but anyway, Thomas, it's a good point, and I will go back and relook at that. I know that there is a major essay called The Transcendent Function, and it's actually, I think it was written in conjunction with the writing of Mysterium Conjunctionis, and so I need to go back and look at that. I have read it years ago, but I don't remember the details at this point. Jeff says, have you delved into any of Manly P. Hall's works? If I remember correctly, he gave Jung access to his occult library for research. He probably did. I remember looking into this once before, Jeff, and I've decided to restrict myself in the sense that we can only do so much in life, and I am really focused on Dr. Jung's work and how Dr. Jung's work is being used in appropriate and inappropriate ways, in my view. And so when people bring me things to look at, and it happens often, it happens almost every day, as a matter of fact, I can't always go back and look at these things. And Manly Hall is one of the ones that probably, you know, if I was going for tenure at some university, I might have to get my arms around, but I have not that restriction, since I do this as an avocation, and I can't keep up. As it is, I'm doing 2 2-hour classes a week, and they frequently turn into 2.5 3-hour classes, and preparing for that is a big task. So that's why I don't do it. But Manly Hall is a very interesting character, and I urge anyone who wants to take a look to take a look. And Jeff says that he had led him into Jung, and I'm not surprised. Grenade says, yeah, Manly P. Hall is good. I fall asleep into his lectures on YouTube all the time. Same here. Okay. Well, I mean, it's getting into your unconscious then. If you're falling asleep while listening to his lectures, you're still listening, even though you're not conscious of it. Especially more sociological ones, because they're a nice balm for the anxious mind. Okay. Andy says Krishnamurti's lectures are right up there with Manly P. Hall. Same school of thought. Oh, well, that's interesting, because I did do a lot of study on Krishnamurti about 20 years ago. There's a book that came out for sale about 20 years ago called Krishnamurti 100 Years. It was 100 years after his birth, and it had a lot of very good information about Krishnamurti. And then I did get into reading a number of his books long ago, but I sort of got shunted back toward Jung somewhere along the line there. And Andy says Jung's the best place to start. Well, I don't, yeah. Actually, Jung can be intimidating. I mean, Jordan Peterson rightly says that many people just bounce off Jung. And I think, except for the generic books like Man and His Symbols and Memories, Dreams, Reflections, I think that you are probably better off reading a few other books first. And those are Gods in Every Man and Goddesses in Every Woman. Both of those books are by Jean Shinoda Bolen. And I'll put these names on the chat. And also Women Who Run with the Wolves. Clarissa Cola. Estes. Okay, so, and the Gods and Goddesses book is Jean Shinoda Bolen. They're both Jungian analysts out in the West. Dr. Estes works in the Denver area, I believe, and Dr. Bolen works in San Francisco. And the reason I mention those for beginners is that they are expressly explaining what the archetypes are. And basically the idea is that the Greek gods, the so-called Greek gods, are actually archetypes. And so if you read these books, you will immediately recognize yourself, so that you'll understand how you are interacting in the world, because all of us tend to have one or two primary archetypes that guide our lives. And so I learned early on that I have two. One is Hermes, which is Mercury, and Hermes is the god who went into the underworld and brought back information from Persephone and from Hades, and so he was the god that could bring things from the unconscious into the conscious. And so you can see in all of my work on this YouTube channel, I'm bringing up into consciousness for the people who subscribe here the ability to see what is happening in the underworld. So that's my Hermes archetype. And the other one is Hephaestus, which is Vulcan. And Vulcan was one of the gods who he was a blacksmith, and he was working at his forge, and so he was a builder of things. And it also happened that he was crippled, and I'm not so crippled as I was, but a couple years back I had both a knee and an ankle replaced, so I was really feeling like Vulcan in those days. But you can see from the fact that I've built this channel up, my tendency to want to build things. And so that's my Vulcan tendency showing through, and our Hephaestus tendency, that's the Latin name and the Greek name. And so if you read those books, you'll definitely recognize yourself and your own tendencies there. And for example, with my wife, she definitely connected up with Diana, who is the huntress. And so Diana was always going out hunting for things. She also links up with Athena, but mainly Diana. So she's hunting for things, but in Diana's in her myth, she is working with a bow and arrow one time during her hunting, and she saw a gourd out in a body of water, and so she fired an arrow at this gourd, and she ended up hitting the head of Orion, who killed Orion, who was her lover. So Orion went up, and so we all know Orion the hunter up in the night sky, and he's up there because Diana accidentally shot an arrow in the air. So when my wife's around, I don't go swimming if she has a bow and arrow. Anyway, Mallory says, I think luckily had a Jungian mentor, but I went to Joseph Campbell's work before getting into Jung. I did the same thing, Mallory. I spent the entire 1990s focused entirely on Campbell's work, and I used to call him my guru. There's a terrific biography of Joseph Campbell called Fire in the Mind, and I can highly recommend that book. I was very taken with it, and at the time I was driving around North Carolina trying to sell my product, and I was driving between hospitals, and I'm reading the book on my steering wheel as I'm driving. That's how intense it was, and it wasn't a very good thing to do. I don't recommend it, but that one book, I remember being so taken by it that I didn't want to stop reading it, but I still wanted to go between my sales call stops. Jeff, I've read the occult a lot, but people like Jung and Campbell are sort of helping hands with that. Yeah, as it should be. I think if you read this book by Peter Kingsley, you'll start to understand the significance of mystery. And, you know, we have many mysteries in our lives. And, you know, that was best expressed in the movie Shakespeare in Love, where Geoffrey Rush is always going along next to Shakespeare, and Shakespeare's kvetching about something going wrong in the theater, and Geoffrey Rush says, "Don't worry, it'll be all right." And Shakespeare says, "How will it?" And Geoffrey Rush says, "I don't know, it's a mystery." And so there are lots of mysteries in life, and you know, the anonymous movement, for example, during the Occupy Wall Street period, had the saying that you can't kill an idea. And that's very true. So you get an idea going, and it mysteriously goes right through a population, you know, like nobody's business. And how does that happen? I don't know. It's a mystery, but it happens very quickly. And so in my experience, both with my website and with this channel, I assume that ideas that people find compelling from my videos will be heard by about 10 times as many people as have actually clicked on a video. In other words, if somebody hears something that I say or someone else says in a chat or what have you, and it's the right idea at the right moment, then it will get spread out into the community very fast, very fast. And I have plenty of examples of how that happens. And some of them are pretty scary, actually. But I'm not going to go into that right now. At some point, I might tell the stories, but let's see. Maybe I can sort of give you a hint. Let me just see if I can give you a hint. There we go. All right, I'm going to give you a link to an article, and this will be a hint. And then at some point I'll tell the whole story about this, but right now it's not even funny, so I'm not going to go into it at this point in time. And he says Hermes Hephaestus types are definitely alive and well in the world. I agree. Mallory says, Fire in the Mind, thanks for the recommendation. Excellent book. I highly recommend that book. It's about 20 years old, but it was very popular originally. Opiami says, I was heard an opinion that Joseph Campbell basically lifted or appropriated a lot of Eliade's work. Yes, I think that's true. And one of the things that, and Jung's work too, by the way, and one of the reasons I got turned off by Campbell and stopped reading him, I'll tell you the story. There were two major reasons. One was that he, who was it that wrote By the Skin of Their Teeth? Anyway, one of famous playwrights. By the Skin of Our Teeth is the name of the play. But anyway, he went to the opening of that play. Oscar Wilde, I think, is the author. And he went to that play in New York, and he got up in the middle of the opening of the play and huffed out, saying that it was plagiarism because it was a copy of James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, which Campbell had just written a book called The Skeleton Key to Finnegan's Wake, and so he was very familiar with everything about Finnegan's Wake. And but the problem is, so he was criticizing Oscar Wilde for plagiarism, and yet I found that a very large percentage of what he talks about in his mythology actually he got from Jung. And I started to really realize that when I got the audio recording, the audible.com recording of Psychology of the Unconscious, which is now called Symbols of Transformation, but there's a terrific reading in the earlier version. Okay, so this was the version that was written in 1912, which caused the break with Freud, and I was having trouble getting into reading actual Jung, and so I always like to try to do it in Audible if I can, and that's one of the reasons why I do the readings and things that I do. And so I find it's easier for me to listen rather than read. And so I got this Audible book called Psychology of the Unconscious, which is the 1912 version of the volume. I think it's volume 5 now in the collected works. And there's just this wonderful reading, and you really get into all this mythology. And as I started to realize that all of this stuff was stuff I had heard from Campbell, but not adequately annotated as Jung's work in Campbell. So that was irritating me, because obviously Jung was working way before Campbell was. And the other one was, I was listening to an Audible or a tape of a Joseph Campbell lecture one time, and there was a Q&A thing, and he was asked by a woman student, what is the meaning of life? And he responded in a very derisive and New York way. He said, "Oh, there's no meaning of life. There's only an experience of life." Well, he really rubbed me the wrong way on that. And after that, I just stopped listening. But I mean, he was a great writer and a great man that did a lot for bringing mythology along into the late 20th century. So, I shouldn't be too critical. And I have several Campbell books on my bookshelf. And if you haven't read The Masks of God, which is his 4-volume text that he wrote over a 12-year period, I highly recommend that series. And especially if you're an artist of any kind, I really recommend you read volume 4 of The Masks of God, which is called Creative Mythology is the name of that particular book. It's volume 4 of The Masks of God. And so and Thomas, as you say, it's a place to go for bibliography, and I did have get references to Jung from Campbell. So I'm not saying he always didn't give Jung credit, but I just didn't feel he gave enough credit. And so, yes, I do agree that he pointed me in several right directions, and one of them was toward Jung. But it took me a decade to figure that out. Pretty much the whole decade of the 90s. So, let's see. Jeff says, I only need the creative mythology volume of the Masks of God. Yeah, I mean, the other ones, the first volume, which is called Primitive Mythology, is pretty gruesome, actually. And, you know, you might not like it, okay, because human beings were doing a lot of human sacrifice 1,000 or 2,000 years or more before the time of Christ. And so it was only with the time of Abraham that human beings were figuring out that God didn't require the sacrifice of their children. But I mean, even that is sublimated, because we're still sacrificing our children in various ways, as you know, and as I painfully know from friends I've lost in the military. And the idea of the monomyth is fairly original with Campbell. It was one of his largest contributions. Yes, fair enough. And he did the great series with Bill Moyers, and that was good. And that was a more human Campbell. That guy sat at his kitchen table. He lived in a 2-room apartment in New York City with his wife for like 40 years. And she was a great dancer. And the two of them lived in a 2-room apartment for like 40 years, and he wrote these books sitting at his kitchen table. And so he did a great thing by explicating all these things, bringing them all up. Obviously, Heroes of 1,000 Faces, or The Hero of 1,000 Faces, is also a great book. And as I say, I spent a decade on it, but then I just got turned off, and I don't know why I did, but that was just me. Renat says, there's no meaning of life, only an experience of life. That sounds like an argument of semantics more than anything else. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, he knew better than that. He shouldn't have said that. And it was just, maybe it was at the end of this lecture he was given, and he was tired and irascible, and it just came across bad. But it really came across bad to me. I remember where I was sitting when I listened to that, because I was sitting in the parking lot of Onslow Memorial Hospital in Jacksonville, North Carolina, when I heard that, and I just remember everything about that moment. It was so shocking to hear that coming from him. And he clearly knew better. Jeff says, I do remember finding that Campbell had that sort of outlook on life, which is inconsistent with his work. I'm gonna hold back on Campbell after this, because I don't want to diss the guy. I used to call Joseph Campbell my guru, and in many ways he was, and I have many of his books, and I think they're important. In fact, the fourth volume of The Masks of God, Creative Mythology. I think I've bought it 3 times because I keep using it so much I tear it apart and have to get a new one. And so I don't want people to misconstrue my attitude toward him, but those were a couple things those were criticisms. And Obiami says the person that told him about Campbell was a Buddhist monk who cross-references everything. And, you know, Campbell and Buddhism and Jung all go together. And amazingly, I ran into, because I've talked to people about the necessity of having a religious experience to really appreciate what Jung was saying when he said, I have no need to believe I know. And so I keep getting referred by Jung to William James's book called Varieties of Religious Experience, which was written at the end of the 19th century. And so by reading that, I got pointed to this lecture, or not a lecture, it was a commencement address for Harvard Divinity School by Ralph Waldo Emerson from July 15th, 1838. And you can still probably find it on the front page of the channel. And it is just remarkable. And even today I was reading to my Buddhist meditation group, which I attend, that the idea of karma was very heavily in that lecture at Harvard College in 1838. And there was about a page and a half of a 19-page talk that was about karma. And so all of these ideas had been spinning around through all the religious traditions. And so, let's see. Yeah, Thomas, I don't remember that discussion in Hero with a Thousand Faces, but now that you mention it, I think I'll go back and look, because I finally grokked it in terms of the difference between Jesus and Buddha from Edinger. And basically what Edinger said was that Jesus was on the ego end of the spectrum and Buddha was on the self end of the spectrum. And that's how Edinger described it. And Mallory says, Campbell's defense, he was an educator. You know, the same is true of Jordan Peterson. You know, I wouldn't want to have to teach psychology anywhere, because then I'd have to learn all the psychologies of all these other jokers. And, you know, not that their work isn't important too, it is, but what I've found is that Jung's work seems to essentialize all of these guys' work in one place, and that's why I focus mainly on Jung these days. And Campbell, so he obviously had to teach a bunch of stuff that maybe he didn't want to teach too. And he may have become a little bit jaded toward his students. He had all women students from Sarah Lawrence College at the time, and or maybe he was at the end of that time, so he'd gotten a certain attitude toward how he was speaking to young women by then. Jeff says, I read The Golden Bough, I can take the blood and gore. Yeah, you'll find it in, especially in volume 1 of the Masks of God. Obiami says, I went off Campbell when I saw him on Oprah. Love to hear that story. Gives us no good to have literary idols. Jung wouldn't want to be that for us, I don't think. That's true. I think that, you know, what I was reading today especially was that Jung was often in his number 2 personality, and he wouldn't even talk to people, anyone, at Bollingen, which was his retreat, because he put himself in his number 2 personality, in his self-personality at Bollingen. And so he, something I'd never heard before, but I think I was reading it in Kingsley today, that he would require people to come to Bollingen and interact with some of his regulars there before he would even talk to them, and he wouldn't talk to them for like a week. And so, you know, it's not that Jung was such a personable guy. I mean, maybe he was personable if you were his analysand, but he had rough edges, I'm sure. And Andy says, right. Andy says, I think Jung would want us to use his tools to advance our understanding. Absolutely. I think, you know, he knew that he was giving us tools that would allow us to then advance and to help others understand that the whole species, the whole human species, is developing to a new level of consciousness. That was his perception. And so he knew he wasn't there. He was just providing the groundwork for us. And it's really a prodigious life's work what he accomplished. I mean, it's just mind-boggling to see how much he wrote in various places. And the president of the Jung Society in Washington was telling me that there are still 35,000 letters that Dr. Jung wrote that have not yet been published, not to mention quite a number of other things that he's published. And apparently he's written, it's something like 100,000 pages. So 35,000 letters and 100,000 pages. Now that seems like an incredible amount, but actually, if you think about it, it's not that much. I mean, it is a lot, but when you think about the fact that he had no computer, he had no television for most of his life, he had no radio, and so in those days, your amusement was your books and your writing and that sort of thing. So, you know, when you break it down over 50 years, 40 or 50 years of productive writing toward the end of his life, you know, it's not that many letters a day. I mean, today I'm writing probably at least 10 fairly complex emails a day to various ones of you, for example. And so, you know, there are a lot of letters out there for interaction. So if anybody wants to publish those letters later on, you'll have to come see Debbie, the huntress, after I'm gone. I have them all, though. Let's see. It says, yeah, like the Tibetan Book of the Dead and Reincarnation often gets mistranslated because death and rebirth can happen within a lifetime being a series of interconnected moments. I agree with that, and that's why I always put in the Job archetype when I mention it, that the fourth stage of the Job archetype is rebirth, because we can die to one thing, like being a rock star when we're in our teens, and be reborn into something else. And I've had to reinvent myself throughout my life, and it's the reason why I strongly favor a liberal arts education, because I believe that you need to learn how to learn, because things change. I mean, my experience with the internet now, and mind you, my wife and I met online in 1985, so this was 10 years before the World Wide Web even got going, but we met on an email network that was a precursor of CompuServe, and I've often made the assertion that we're the first couple to meet online and marry, and nobody's ever challenged that. So we were an early one anyway. We were early adopters, and so things are changing. Let's see, and so I've had to be reborn many times. I just was seeing the internet just go into a new life every month almost in the early days. Now it's settled down a little, but not that much. Hopiami says Jean Jardin is a lesser-known academic philosopher who also was wary of literary idols. Okay, Thomas Buddha and his bow tree, Jesus and the Holy Road, or Ritter Road. I'm not familiar with that term. Grenade says Jung helped translate the ideas with psychological rebirth. Right, and keep in mind now, Edinger has delineated for us the stages of religious development. So what he has pointed out to us is the Judaism period from Abraham to Christ was a period of the law, when the Ten Commandments were dominant, and so on. And then when Jesus came along, there was a gradual transformation into a religion of belief. This is in the West, of course. And what Edinger and Jung were talking about was now a third stage of religion, which is a religion based on psychology. So when Edinger, and you can find it in the essay or the talk he gave, which is linked underneath this video, he said that, God fell out of heaven and into the human psyche around 1500 because of the scientific method. And so we've all been trying to learn how to live with that fact ever since. And by the 19th century, it got pretty sad. and so some of the poems that I read last week sort of give an indication of that. If you listen to Dover Beach or The Second Coming by W.B. Yeats, those indicate how bad psychologically things got in the late 19th century, culminating in Nietzsche's saying God is dead. And then Jung had to say, no, wait a minute, God isn't dead, but God isn't where you said it was. It's someplace else. And Jeff says, oh yeah, Thomas says Buddha and with Mara tempting him, Jesus tempted by Satan. Yes, there definitely is a parallel there. Jeff says, I have the Evan Wentz translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead with Jung's introduction. I found it too. I found an antique copy of it, a first, I don't know if it's a first printing, but it's a very early printing of it. I gave it to my wife for Christmas one year. It's probably, if I lean over, you could probably see it on her bookshelf. It's a great thing, but it's also in the I think it's in volume 11 of the collected works, which is Psychology and Religion. If it's not there, it's in volume 18, which is the Symbolic Life. Bernard says, Tibetan Buddhists spoke mainly in metaphors, and the West took it literally. That's our problem. We tend to take things too literally. And Taurus is Thomas Odin and Yggdrasil. Yep. And Jung called Odin Wotan and wrote his famous essay, Wotan, which is in volume 10 of the collected works. In 1936, he was trying to provide a warning to Western Europe about what was going to happen with Nazism. Unfortunately, he was way too late, and he realized that there was already a bad psychic epidemic going on, and so all of his warnings fell on deaf ears. Oh, I see. Thomas says, root is the way they used to call the cross. Okay, that's a new one on me. I guess I'm not that much of a Christian scholar. It's pronounced rude. Okay, interesting. Good to know. Jeff, well, it is pretty rude way of execution. Yes, it is. And Andy says, can any man truly be at peace with himself and the world? Jung seems to so content in the videos I've seen. At times it would seem understanding comes with anguish. He was always anguished. I mean, Jung was constantly bitching in his letters. If you read the 2 volumes of letters, and you can find them, you know where. If you read the 2 volumes of letters, nearly every major letter that he writes, he's complaining about his old age or how he's not understood or what have you. But I do agree with you that he was basically at peace with himself, and especially by the time people got around to interviewing him on camera. By then he knew that he would be posthumous. In other words, he knew that he wasn't going to change any minds during his lifetime, but he also knew what he had done. And he knew that inevitably people would have to come around to it. And so that was a very important fact for him, and would have made him, at peace, because he knew that it was inevitable. And, the person that's written the best about this is Dr. Thomas Arst, and you can find his essay on, as the first essay in Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul in Postmodern Conditions. There you will find that playlist highlighted on the front page of this channel, and I read it in two parts. So the first two parts, there are two essays that are under that under that rubric are there in on the front page, and you should listen to that because that's a profound essay in many ways. And I'm hoping that you folks are still hearing me because I'm showing a red sign on my stream health, which doesn't seem very positive. But I will keep talking as long as I have something to say. And Group says, I think Jung achieved a high level of personal and spiritual development akin to Jesus or Buddha. But again, that doesn't mean he should be put on a pedestal as if we are not worthy, but to learn from him. Yeah, I don't think he would have wanted to be put on a pedestal per se, but he knew what his work was and meant. Thomas says, yeah, Jeff, as the dialogue goes in The Fisher King, Perry says, what do you think of the death penalty? And John says, death is definitely a penalty. It ain't no fucking gift. Yep. And yeah, I did love that movie long ago. It's now 20 years ago, I guess. I'll have to watch it. The other, was it last night? Yeah, it was last night when we were watching the Academy Awards, and my wife and I were bored out of our skulls in the early going, so we watched Spotlight instead in honor of the end of the Pope's sexual conclave in Rome. And I just, after I read the reports on the results of that conclave, I said, oh my God, I hope the Pope has seen that movie. Good grief. Yeah, okay, I see that the stream is glitching, but I'm gonna keep talking because I can see my face getting through, and I can see your comments still. And so Jeff, you dipped back into the Arthurian legend lately, and what I would highly recommend is the Grail legend. Let me see. Yeah, I can even reach it. So, this is the Grail legend by Emma Jung and Marie-Louise von France. Emma conned Carl into allowing her to do the Grail legend. And it's a project that she worked on all her life and put together a lot of material over many, many years. And she did research in England, and Carl went with her for weeks at a time, and they did research. And it really is worth it, because this story of the Arthurian legend is phenomenal, and it's really central to Jungian psychology. So in some sense, I'm a bit surprised Dr. Jung let her do that. I see. Okay, so you're reading Morte d'Arthur. That's also a good one. And Jeff, I don't think that Jung himself wrote very much on the Grail legend. I mean, he referred to it a bit, but as I said, he cut that legend out and left it to Emma to focus on, and that was a deal that the two of them made early in their careers. And so he did not per se talk very much about it. He did to a certain degree, and one of the things he talked about was the fact that the Arthurian knights would enter the forest at the darkest place to them. That's where you enter the forest, which is you have to face your biggest fears. That's the idea psychologically. And yeah, I'm not sure this is still in publication, but it's Princeton paperbacks, and there's the book. And I think I bought it as a used book because, as you see, I mark books up very heavily. Dr. Jung was once asked what his spiritual practice was, and he said underlining books, and that's been my practice for a long time. So I often buy used books, and whether new or used, for example, Catafalque, which I'm still working on, as you see, it's a brand new book, but I've already marked it up pretty heavily. And I'm going to have a lot to say about it in short order. I did have a conversation with Peter Kinsley about it last week, which was a lovely conversation, and I look forward to having a further conversation with him about it, or maybe more than one. But it's very, very interesting. And so, and he says, look up the Red Book of Her Jest, R.R. Tolkien. I know that Tolkien wrote a Red Book, what is her name? Tarnis. Her father is the famous Tarnis writer, and Becca Tarnis. There's a wonderful video of Becca Tarnis in fact, there's more than one, but when the Red Book of C.G. Jung came out in 2009, they had a 2-day seminar at the Library of Congress on the Red Book. And Becca Tarnis gave one of the more interesting presentations at that, which was sort of an early presentation on her PhD thesis, which actually came out, I think, in 2015 or something like that. But she had done a few presentations about her PhD thesis where she compared the Red Book with Tolkien's Red Book. And so that's worth finding on YouTube. It's quite available. And Thomas says, I've not read Von Franz as much as I should have. And I have to say, I have not either. But she's actually quite a good writer. She and Peter Kingsley would have been oil and water, though, because one of the things that Peter very seriously gets into in Catafalque is that the women around Jung were airbrushing Jung so that he wasn't seeming so much like a dirty old man. And among other things, but just give you a perfect example of it. So this is Man and His Symbols, the hardbound version of it. And there is a PDF version of this in the Dropbox. And if you look at page 25, pull this out here because it's just, it's something that I discovered a while back. I discovered before I found Peter complaining, but there were all these women in Dr. Jung's life on the first row of, this is a picture of the the first Weimar Congress on psychoanalysis in 1911 in Weimar, Germany. And Marie-Louise von Franz put this book together, but here in this picture, she's identified quite a number of the participants, but many of the women on the front row are not identified. And one of the ones that's not identified is Toni Wolff, and even Beatrice Hinkle isn't identified, but Luz Salome isn't identified. She was a paramour of Rilke's, and Maria Moltzer is identified. And there was a rumor that Dr. Jung had something going with Maria Moltzer, who was a nun. And anyway, she was certainly an analysand of Jung's, and this was back in the days before psychotherapists had ethics rules going with them. And so anyway, Marie-Louise von Franz, when she put Man and His Symbols together after Jung's death, she just airbrushed the names of those women out of the book. And that's just one example of what Peter is talking about. And so that's one of the interesting things about Catafalque, which is that Peter Kingsley calls out all the so-called Valkyries. There were quite a number of women that were working around Jung for many years, including Agnella Jaffe, who was responsible for Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And she was accused later on of airbrushing a lot of things out of Jung's experience too, and Peter calls her on it. And what's going to be interesting, I think in 2020, we'll have the publication of the protocols. Now, Memories, Dreams, Reflections is the severely edited by the family and by Agnella Jaffe of Jung's experiences, his autobiography of his psychic development. But it only covered about half the material that he gave to Agnella Jaffe, and the rest of the material was hidden away, and it's only now coming to light. And there is a version of it in German, and there will be an English publication in 2020 that's been announced by by the Philemon Foundation, I believe, and that will be a very interesting thing to see, because it's going to be much franker about what was really going on in this community around Jung during his lifetime. Thomas says, after reading the book about Pauli and Jung, I feel I've seen a different side of him. It seems there is a mystic Jung and a scientist Jung, with first one or the other coming into focus. That's definitely true. This is personality number one and personality number two. And so the scientist Jung was personality number one, the ego Jung, and the mystic Jung is the personality number 2. And hard to say which he really is. He's really both, actually. And that's why it's significant to now be reading in Kingsley's book this fact about when Jung went to Bollingen, he put himself in personality number 2 and stayed there. And he did comment on one occasion that if you came and visited him at Bollingen, the only thing that you would find in the building that would be unrecognizable by a person of the 16th century were his matches. Other than that, everything, the building was not plumbed, and it was not electrified, and it had no running water during his lifetime. And so he lived in it as basically a medieval building, and he wanted to have that part of himself come through, and it certainly did. Andy says, I think Jung was reality checking his own motivations and hypotheses. Always. I think that's always true. You know, he sort of got whacked after his interview with the BBC, because when he said, I have no need to believe I know, he got a ton of mail about that. And people thought he was saying that he knew that there was a metaphysical God, and that isn't what he was saying. But, you know, but not quite. I mean, actually he was too, because in a sense, everything in psychology is metaphysical. And, you know, scientists, empirical scientists, people that study the brain, don't know squat about the psyche. I mean, they can't, I mean, maybe they can tell in what part of the brain certain activity is taking place, but they certainly can't tell what you're dreaming or anything like that. You know, that's what Jung was telling us in his books, and science hasn't even bothered to go back and look at that yet, and that's a big mistake, because there are huge areas of research that need to be done, and they'll only be done if people stop dissing Jung and start recognizing that he had a point. and so, you know, he wrote Mysterium Conjunctionis, which we're handling in the advanced reading group, and that is really the story of alchemical imagery. So each week we're talking about several alchemical images, and although Jung didn't put these images in his book, so his book is quite tame. Edinger, in the Mysterium Lectures, went and looked up all the images that Jung was talking about in Mysterium. So this is one of a dead woman in the grave with a dragon. That's an example. And that is an alchemical image from the 16th century. And another one is the sun as the 4 seasons. See if we can get it close enough so you can have a look at it. Okay, that's another alchemical image that has the zodiac across here, and this is the sun in the four seasons. So it's showing them side by side, and it also shows zodiacal creatures on the table. So there's a mouse, a lobster, I guess it's a scale, and a goat. And I don't know if you can see that, but I'll try to show it to you here. Okay, so and for example, here are the opposites. So Dr. Jung is showing the opposites of the fish from Pisces, and then opposites of a lion and a flying lion, male and female lions, and then a wolf and a dog fighting, and a flying creature attached to a frog. And so those are all opposites, and Dr. Jung is describing how those fit together, and therefore they represent what's happening in our psyche, in our modern psyche. And at some point here, I may get to the poly dreams, and we'll start to see how that worked with Wolfgang Pauli, which is what you're talking about, Thomas. So Thomas says, belief is something we acquire secondhand, isn't it? The beliefs of our parents, of our forefathers, or country, or a group mind knowledge, as gnosis comes in a different way. I think that that's right, Thomas. Gnosis comes from experience. And Dr. Jung was definitely saying that we can't learn anything without experience. So, you can explain to a kid logically till you're blue in the face and they won't hear you. But, it's like, you tell the little kid the stove is hot, and they don't believe you, and then they go over and touch the stove, and then they go, okay, now I know what hot is. And so, that's the difference between, do you believe your parents when they tell you the stove is hot, or do you know the stove is hot and what that can do to you? And so yes, and this is what Dr. Jung was talking about, and what Jordan Peterson is also talking about now, where, and even Paul van der Klee, when Paul is recognizing that Jordan Peterson is revivifying people's religion, because he's able to give people the experience. And maybe even I'm hoping that I'm doing that with some of you, where you're understanding that some of the experiences you've already had may have been these types of religious experiences that make it so that something is right. And that was what happened to me, because when I first saw that video, the very first time I saw it, I heard Jung say, I have no need to believe, I know. And immediately I had an epiphany, and I said, I know too, okay? And the question is, okay, then what do I know? Okay, and it took me a while to work out what I did know, but I had that epiphany at that time that I actually already had the experience, and on multiple occasions. Hobiabi says, Jung's conflicting senses. Eugene Gendlin may have said, "The bad feeling is the body knowing and pushing toward what good would be." Yeah, that's an interesting way of thinking about it, actually, Andy. There is no evolution of man without predation, either physical or mental. Or pain. If you include within that pain, then I agree. And often we don't know anything unless there's blood, and so there will be blood because that's the only way humans learn things, is through blood. And I think, okay, here's my essay on that topic. There will be blood. There's a famous Daniel Day-Lewis movie called There Will Be Blood a few years ago. I think it won an Academy Award. But it was pretty bloody, but that's the way we learn. And alchemical imagery speaks to those versed in its imagery and meaning. Archetypal symbols are an intellectual catalyst. That's actually not quite right, Andy. What Jung was saying was that the reason the alchemical images were important, the medieval ones, was that they emerged before there was epistemological criticism. In other words, before people were tearing one another up as right or wrong, these images emerged and were projected from the psyche of these medieval alchemists, and therefore he was saying that those represent archetypal themes. And then what was happening to him was that he was seeing the same sorts of images in his patients, not the least of whom was Wolfgang Pauli, with whom he got about 1,000 dreams, I believe, over time. About 55 of them are in this book. So in terms of what you said, then alchemical imagery speaks to those versed in its imagery. Well, yeah, obviously, because if you don't know anything about alchemy, you're not going to connect with it at all. And meaning archetypal symbols are an intellectual catalyst. I think the better way to say it is that archetypal symbols are a psychological catalyst, that it's the archetypes that are in control. It's not us that's in control. It's not our rational mind that's in control. I mean, the simplest way to think about it is a woman who has a baby, and she's immediately taken over by the mother archetype, and it's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And a man cannot intellectually actually grasp what that means. I mean, I can show you examples that I can get you close to it, but it's not a question of rationality, in my opinion. You may respond, though. Opiami says, true. First person felt experience is primary before anything we are conditioned to, absolutely. And Brandon, Kingsley's excellent book starts with the fundamental conflict of Empedocles. Competing claims have to be balanced in our awareness and consciously given their place in our lives. I think that the issue here for Kingsley is that Plato and Aristotle turned everything into rationality, and they didn't want to address the irrational parts of the psyche that Empedocles and Parmenides spoke of. That's Peter Kingsley's big thing. And the problem is that then we got going down this chute through the centuries for over 2,000 years of being on this rational side of the track. And now we can't get out of it. It's very hard to get out of it and understand that there's more to life and that we can't just live our lives based on rationality, because it doesn't work that way. And we've all been misguided by thinking that we can find happiness by being totally rational. We just can't. And I'm glad to see you've read it, though, Brandon. Jonathan Arkellis says, I know this sounds crazy, but often feel guided by a force that seemed to point me in a certain positive direction, almost as if God is guiding me. Most recently, it's the form of numbers such as 777. Well, that doesn't sound crazy at all to the rest of us that are here, Jonathan, because that's yourself doing that guiding. And by the way, it's in charge. And so if you go back to the Star Wars movies and the first introductions of the Force in the Star Wars movie, that pretty much sums it up. The Force is with you, and the Force is the self, and it's making you do certain things. There's no doubt about that. And Jonathan says 6 is for 7's for good and 6 is for bad. Have you ever heard of this? Yeah, there's certainly a lot in numerology about, evil in odd number or even numbers, I guess it is, and the masculine in the odd numbers and the feminine in the even numbers and sort of that sort of thing. I do not remember the origins of the 666 number, but obviously it is a significant number, and it has come down through numerology as representing evil and the devil. And the problem is, I don't think we know well enough about it. But there are lots of books about numerology around, so you could learn about that if you wish. Jeff says, yeah, I feel that to an extent got to be open to that direction. And the force is with you, and the point is that you are going to do best in life if you're living the life yourself wants you to live. And if you try to fight it, you're going to end up with depression and anxiety and all kinds of things. And the question is, how to be sensitive to it. And Dr. Jung talked about it in Answer to Job, paragraph 746. And he said, he says, the conscious realization of what is hidden and kept secret certainly confronts us with an insoluble conflict. At least this is how it appears to the conscious mind. But the symbols that rise up out of the unconscious in dreams show it rather as a confrontation of opposites, and the images of the goal represent their successful reconciliation. And so keep in mind, this is thesis, antithesis, and the symbol comes forth and provides a synthesis. And so something empirically demonstrable comes to our aid from the depths of our unconscious nature. It is the task of the conscious mind to understand these hints. If this does not happen, the process of individuation will nevertheless continue. The only difference is that we become its victims and are dragged along by fate toward the inescapable goal, which we might have reached walking upright if only we had taken the trouble and been patient enough to understand in time the meaning of the noumena that cross our path. The only thing that matters now is whether man can climb up to a higher moral level, to a higher plane of consciousness, in order to be equal to the superhuman powers which the fallen angels have played into his hands. Well, I'm not going to read the whole book, but that's the point, that these noumena come up and offer you a direction, and if you fight them, you're going to have a hard time. You're going to get dragged along instead of getting to the goal and walking upright, as he says. And Jeff says, I like how the Rosicrucians felt the rose on the cross was a more positive symbol than the bloodied Christ. I agree with that. I always thought it was pretty, well, never mind. And Paulie came up with 137 as a sacred number. Yes, he did. And I don't recall the rationale for that, but that is the number. That's the perfect sacred number. Andy says, I had an extensive talk with a Rosicrucian monk priest. They admitted that those in charge weren't concerned with good nor evil, only getting people to believe in their ideas. Yeah, and the problem is if you intermediate yourself between a person and God, they're never going to have the direct experience, and therefore the belief is not very strong. Ruth says, doesn't the cross remind anyone else of the corpus callosum? Corpus callosum, yes. If you were to imagine the brain cut in half. Yes, we have all kinds of stuff on this. Well, I don't have it right here. I have it up there. But this is exactly where alchemists were going, and it's very heavily covered in ion. And so if you become a member of our advanced reading group, you can see our entire seminar now on ion, which is 32 sessions. And in that, there are definitely diagrams. Unfortunately, I have a lot of books right in front of me here, but I don't have that one. Anyway, but you're right, Ruth, quite right. And so that's where you can find it in ion, and in the ion lectures by Edward Edinger. And you can also find it in the 32 seminar sessions that we did over the last 9 months or so in about ion. Opiami says, Eugene Gendon studied Jung in depth, but was a student under Carl Rogers' direct tutelage in psychology before gaining a PhD in philosophy in 1958. He developed Focusing Institute, which is worldwide now. Okay. Don't know about that. Jonathan says, what are noumena? They are religious experiences. Let's put it that way. Let me just see. I might be able to show you one if I still have it here and it still will come up. Let's just show you one if I can. Okay, maybe this is it. And this one. Okay, so here's the background. I have gone through a very difficult time in part of my life over the last 8 years. And I will discuss it in greater length at some point, but not quite yet. And I was fighting foreclosure on my home. And I had a home that was worth $1.2 million. And I lost it because of the crash of 2008. And so I've had a number of very depressing times because I fought this foreclosure for almost 9 years. And I've just a month ago stopped fighting. And so during this period, I filed more than 4,000 pages of documents demonstrating that the financial industry had defrauded the American people and basically harvested the life savings of the baby boom, at least everything that was in real estate. And so during some of these depressed days, I've been known to go into the chapel at the U.S. Naval Academy and just sit in meditation. And on this one day at about 10:30 in the morning, so this is your answer to Noumena, Jonathan. At 10:30 or so in the morning, I went into the chapel, and it was very dark in there except for the lighting from the windows. And I sat down in one of the side pews, and I was looking over toward this Tiffany window that has Jesus Christ in it. And as I was sitting there, sort of in my blue funk, suddenly a light came in through the window. And this is what it looked like. And I was just mind-boggled by that. And it shined only on me. And the whole rest of the chapel was dark, but only where I was sitting was this light on me. And I was so taken by it, I said, oh my God, nobody's even going to believe this. So I pulled up my camera, my iPhone, and I took this picture. And then I flipped it around and took this picture of the light on me, just to prove it. And so here I am sitting in this dark chapel, and the only light on the place was this light coming in through the window. And it was shining only on me. So that is, in my experience, that is a numinous experience. Now, it may not affect you in the same way it did me, and that's fair enough because each of these things is personal. But you could see, obviously, from those images, how my attitude just totally changed. I mean, obviously, I was quite sort of ecstatic when that happened. And I said, wow, maybe I better chill. Maybe things aren't as bad as I thought. And so anyway, Ruth asks, can I sign up on your website? For the advanced reading group, just send me an email to skip.conover@gmail.com, and I will get you signed up. I'll just put it in there so it's easy for you to find, but that's how we make those things available. Thomas says, noumena is a Latin term for divinity or divine presence, divine will, i.e. St. Paul had a numinous experience. Right, okay, so St. Paul had his experience on the road to Damascus, and that was his experience. Obviously, Job had a whole series of experiences with Yahweh about 500 years BC, and Dr. Jung had 5 years worth of numinous experiences during his Red Book period. And so once you start to, I mean, there's, as I said earlier, there's this William James book called Varieties of Religious Experience, and I have gotten it on audible.com, and I'm reading it now. So it's interesting. He talks about a lot of different ways that these religious experiences occur, but when he talks about religious experience, it's the same thing as what Dr. Jung is talking about, a numinous experience. So, Jonathan, I've had many of these noumena since about 12 years old. Back then, they were just these series of coincidences. They often come up as synchronicities, and I have synchronicities almost daily. So it's very common. And so what is a synchronicity? It's an acausal connecting principle. In other words, there is no cause. And the way it happens is because your mind is, your psyche is ready for something. And that's unconscious. You don't know about it, but it's ready for something. And then something gets presented, and that readiness connects. Okay, it's like a hook that the event hooks onto, and that's a synchronous experience, and it comes across very often as a numinous experience. And Thomas says, we have to be open to these numinous experiences. It seems, doesn't it? They often happen at times of psychic trouble, in my experience. Yes, but they can also happen just with a tarot reading. For example, people can be very profoundly moved by a tarot reading, but all a tarot reading does is it provides a lot of things to hook on the hooks of your psyche. And so I often say that I could throw the tarot cards across a stage in an auditorium with 1,000 people and just do a reading directly off the stage, and everyone would think I'd done a reading for them. And the reason is that everyone has some resonance or some readiness in their psyche. But we don't know what it is. You don't know what it is, and I don't know what it is. And I also don't know what the reading is that you're hearing. But if I just say enough things in the tarot reading, I'll connect to everybody in the room in some way. And for every person, it will be different. But it will be numinous, too, in that way, and in that synchronous way. And so Jeff says, synchronicity and deja vu are constants in my life. So you're really blessed then, Jeff. And as you think about them more, you'll appreciate them more. And Andy says, not all numinous experiences are positive and happy. That's right. It's not all sunshine and rainbows, as Vincent Kennedy says in his interview. And so the issue is that as we go into individuation and begin to recognize that we're in this field of opposites, it can be quite ugly, unpleasant. in many ways. Just as most synchronicity happens to me in finding books of subjects that I begin to want to learn about. And that happens with it happened with my wife yesterday, where she wanted a very specific Buddhist book. And if you look at her file, her bookshelf behind me there, she's got 6 shelves of books, and she wanted a very specific book. And she didn't want to have to read through all the titles because they're all on their side and so on. So she just came up to the bookcase, closed her eyes, and put her hand on the bookcase, and she had the exact one. And so those things can often happen. And Andy says, synchronicity is always present. The more you recognize patterns, the more synchronicity manifests. Absolutely. And if you're conscious of them, of synchronous events, they'll definitely happen. Yami says, I think these kind of noumena or synchronicities occur frequently if we pay attention to being in the moment, no matter what you're doing and where you are. Absolutely true. And once you start to experience these noumena, then you start to know. Okay, then you know. And that's how it works. And Thomas says, seeing Oswald shot live on television at age 10 was a numinous experience for me. Absolutely, I'm sure it was. I mean, I happened to be in Japan when that happened, but when President Kennedy was shot, it certainly was a numinous experience for me when my father woke me, and because for me, we learned at it in the early morning in Japan, and he said, Skip, wake up, the president's been shot. And I started to say, is he okay? And then my father finished the sentence and said, and killed. And then he said, and I'm going, we're on alert at the Navy base, and so I'm going, and you're in charge for as long as I'm gone. I was a senior in high school when that happened. And so, yeah, I've had a lot of books over the years, Thomas. I've had to get rid of them, a few of them, but I still have my Jung books. Opiami says, I don't see them a woo moments or experiences. They can be everyday banal experiences. Yes, indeed. They're not, this is not woo necessarily, but at the same time, it's uncanny. It's often something that you can't explain how it happened, and I think the importance of the event can make it more and more woo-woo, but nonetheless, it's still all synchronicity, I think. Jeff says, I've got some Eastern philosophy. I really love the Max Muller translation of the Upanishads. You're ahead of me on that one. I have the Upanishads, but I've not read it. Because we're always ready for something, our minds being like hooks. As you say, this takes away from the religious or spiritual aspect of the humans. I don't think so. I don't think it takes away. I think it adds. And I think it makes you sensitive to the noumena. And, enough of them happen to me, including the one I just showed you, that have involved actual religious style events that I think it makes me more spiritual, definitely. And Thomas says, I took many of mine to yoga class and gave them away. I'm sure people appreciated that very much. Okay, so I've been talking and you all have been listening. But let's, and here's one thing we haven't done, which is we have not said a word about psychology and alchemy. And I don't mind that because I think I've sort of resigned myself to the idea that this Monday night session can be a general discussion that's useful to you. And I do try to be responsive even when I'm doing readings during the week, but I can't always schedule those. And so as long as you're happy and you're here, I will keep talking with you on Monday nights, and I won't try to seriously direct the discussion, except if you slow down, in which case I'll go back into psychology and alchemy. But I don't think we've made any progress on that whatsoever tonight. So I think it's been a good discussion. I hope you all feel like it has been. Opiami says the uncanniness comes in for me when the synchronicity repeats itself. Andy says, like Bernie Sanders running again. I'm gonna leave that aside for now. But anyway, I'll look forward to seeing you all in the future. I don't know what I have to read for tomorrow, but I'll think of something. In the meantime, once again, I urge you to find this book. It's a 2-volume set, Catafalque, and it's $75 in Amazon. So what I urge you to do, if that is too big of a hit for you, is go to your library or your school library and ask for the book on interlibrary loan, and then you can read it for free. And you can also then help Peter Kingsley because it will create a demand for his book. And the book is quite worthwhile. It took him 5 years to write it, and I believe, as I've now read more than half of it, I can tell you I think that the work is there, and it's quite a valuable book in many ways. And so if you can't afford it, please go to your local library and ask for it on interlibrary loan. That will help Peter. And Andy says, thanks, Skip. I think we all just love your opinions on these topics. Well, that's nice to hear. I'm glad because on these Monday night events, because we can't interact by voice, it feels like I'm talking to myself frequently and obviously looking at a camera. So it's sometimes hard to see that there's value to it, but as long as you folks are happy, I'm happy. Bruce says, thank you. I don't say much in chat at all, but I'm here listening. Okay, well, that's good. Now, in the advanced reading group, we do that on Zoom, and so that is an interactive process in which we can see one another. And so if you're joining our advanced group, which I urge you to do, then you should have a camera on your device if possible. You can do it on your cell phone. It's not the easiest way, but you can do it on an iPad or a computer. And it's best if you can put your eyes about between 60% and 70% from the bottom of the image. That is the best framing of your face when you're on those discussions. And Jonathan says there's value. Okay, great. Thank you all for coming tonight. I am going to terminate because my voice is dying, and so this will be on playback in a few minutes, and then and you'll be able to see it in a few minutes on the website, on the YouTube channel. And also, if you can help me by both subscribing and sharing this video on your social networks, I'd very much appreciate it, or any of my videos, and particularly on places like Reddit and any of the sites that keep URLs. That's helpful to attract people to the site. We've been growing pretty rapidly, about 10 new subscribers a day, but ironically we've fallen below the 50% level. In other words, we were at about 48% subscribers and 52% people that were just coming in and looking at videos but not subscribing. And then I mentioned this, and the number went up to 52%. So we actually had more than half of the people that were looking at videos that were subscribers, but now it's dropped down again to 48%. So if you're not a subscriber, I urge you to subscribe and to hit the little notification bell on the videos, any of the videos, so that you can be a part of these things going forward. There's plenty to look at. There's now over 860 videos on this channel, and even I'm shocked. I had no idea that this would keep going this long and start to gain some following like this. I'm very pleased about that. And we do have about 48 participants in the seminar. However, up until now, only about 5 or 6 at any one session are able to actually attend, and the rest listen to the sessions on playback. So I'm hoping that we can recruit a few more folks who are available on Wednesdays at 1:30 in the afternoon. We do it at that time so that it's available to our European followers, since about a half of our subscribers and participants in the advanced group are from Europe. And this session, the Monday night session, is always much too late for them. I mean, we don't start until 1 a.m. London time, and about 4 or 5 in the morning Sophia time. And so this session is very late for our European followers, but I do the advanced session at a time that both Europeans and even early risers in Hawaii can watch. And I think Opiami is in New Zealand, so you're blessed by being on the other side of the globe, and so it must be morning for you where you are, I suppose. Anyway, thank you and good night. I'll see you next week. All things being equal.